Hello and welcome. My name is Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Bonnie Gardner will now introduce our speaker, Ms. Buls.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be able to introduce Paula Buls, licensed clinical social worker, who's going to be speaking on progress towards equality for the LGBTQ community. The LGBTQ community has experienced unprecedented civil rights advances in the last 15 years. From gay marriage to trans visibility and protection, it has been a time of great forward movement. Paula will be discussing basic terminology and guidelines for how to be an effective ally to the LGBTQ community. She'll also be discussing the current political climate and upcoming legislative action and how these might impact LGBTQ civil rights. A little bit about her background. She was the first openly trans woman to graduate from the UT School of Social Work in Austin. She was a founding member of the Transgender Education Network of Texas. She served on the board of directors for the Austin Gay and Lesbian International Film Festival, and she's currently serving on the Human Rights Commission for the City of Austin. Aside from her work as a trans and queer activist, she is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice in Austin. Let's give her a warm welcome. Paula?
Thank you all so very much for being here and coming out on this cold, drizzly day. I want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are now. Specifically, when I was a child, I remember the only time I ever really remember hearing about gay people was either very derogatory things from people like my coach as they were giving the sex ed lecture, which invariably went to the phys ed coach, in which they talked about how horrible gay people were, or there were actually public service announcements on television coming on that would warn young men to be careful if they went to public parks because there would be guys driving around trying to pick them up. And these were very dangerous predators. So that's kind of the climate that gave rise to stigma, marginalization, and a distrust of gay people. Trans people weren't even in the picture at that point. If you were a young person and you were starting to grow and question your own sexual orientation or your gender identity, the only thing you knew about gay people was that they were predators. And so this lent a huge amount of struggle for LGBT people just in terms of accepting their own nature and their own being, such that very often people grew up with an intense dislike for being gay and a need to feel ashamed and guilty, to feel like who they were was less than worthy of love and affection. Slowly, public perception began to shift. In 1968 or 69, there was a series of riots at a small nightclub in South Manhattan called the Stonewall Inn. And this was a small bar that was owned by the mafia and that was run as a gay nightclub, and lots of trans people went there to congregate. And regularly, because at that time there were cross-dressing laws in most of the areas of the United States. And what those laws meant was that if someone was wearing articles of clothing that were normally worn by the other gender, then they could be arrested. And so regularly the police would make raids on the Stonewall Inn and arrest patrons for not dressing appropriately. And one night in June of I forget if it was 68 or 69, the patrons of the bar said, we're not going to stand up for that. And there was a series of riots that went on over a period of days. That is frequently held as the beginning of the modern LGBT civil rights movement. It was the first time that people there had been previous attempts to do that, but this was the first one that really gained public acceptance. And today, most pride celebrations around the world are held in June to commemorate the Stonewall riots. In terms of widespread acceptance of LGBT people, I think the really big break came in the 1994 when Ellen DeGeneres came out on her television show and openly declared herself to be a lesbian. And that was the first time that people really began to look at people in the LGBT community and realize that they couldn't hold that perception, that stigmatizing perception that they had of gay people with who Ellen DeGeneres is. She's cuddly. How can you hate on Ellen? And so it caused people to start really questioning those previously held beliefs. And slowly we start having more and more visibility of LGBT people. I think one of the places that this was most significant was in the realm of media, as more television shows started portraying LGBT people not in a stigmatizing, marginalizing, predatory kind of a manner, but as real human beings, intelligent, compassionate, non-predatory human beings. And slowly that perception started changing. We started moving towards a movement of marriage equality. In terms of the transgender community, we've lagged about 20 years behind the gay and lesbian community. At the time that I came out in 1999, there were literally zero locations that had any kind of civil rights protection for transgender people. Typically, unemployment in the trans community ran around 40%. Approximately 60% of trans individuals had attempted suicide at least once. There was an incredible level of marginalization. If you could find work at all, it often tended to be sex work, which of course led to even more stigmatization. Murders of transgender people were rampant and usually went uninvestigated. Typically, they were hyper violent, that people not only murdered trans people, but they did it very violently. They would do things like beat someone to death with a fire extinguisher until they were a pulp. That was typical, and very often the prevailing attitude was, well, what did they expect? In 1999, there was a murder of a transgender woman in Boston named Rita Hester, and following her death, there was a vigil to commemorate her death the following year on November 20th. And that has since become what is known as the Transgender Day of Remembrance, in which people in the transgender community meet to memorialize and remember the members of that community who were lost to violence during the previous year. Visibility of trans people and kind of that same phenomenon as happened with Ellen DeGeneres really only started 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago. We had people like Chaz Bono, who came out as transgender and as a trans man and who started his transition process. We had TV shows like Orange is the New Black with Laverne Cox, who's just absolutely one of my heroes. people like Janet Mock. We're just now coming to a place where we have favorable images of transgender people in the media. And so that same phenomenon of looking at trans people, I once did a survey looking back at the last 50 years of transgender people in media. And there were one or two really nice examples. Probably my favorite was John Lithgow in the movie The World According to Garp, in which John Lithgow played a trans woman named Roberta Muldoon. It was a wonderful portrayal, very sympathetic, very loving. Unfortunately, if you look at it, you also go, yeah, but that's John Lithgow. That's not a real person. And so until we had people like Laverne Cox coming out where you could say, oh my God, this is a real transgender person, that it started really humanizing who trans people were. Other than that, it's amazing how many trans people were being portrayed in the media as serial killers. You know, Jamie Gumb in Silence of the Lambs being a very notable example. And so, again, trans people being portrayed sex workers, as serial killers. If you look at just sheer numbers, the number one most frequent place where transgender people were seen in the media was on the Jerry Springer Show. Doing a survey of trans people in the media in the last 50 years, I came up with probably about 50 examples with the exception of Jerry Springer. And when I went to the Jerry Springer Show and I just Googled on their website tranny, which is considered a derogatory term these days, tranny, and I came up with 15 pages, each page of which had maybe 15 different shows with titles like My Boyfriend Was a Tranny, My Sister Dated a Tranny, whatever. That was the number one place in which people got their public information about what a transgender person was. So we're in a place of changing. In 2000, a group of us got together here in Austin, and we formed an organization which we called ATGOI. That stood for the Austin Transgender Ordinance Initiative. And our goal was to add transgender gender identity protections in our city ordinances for employment, housing, and public accommodation. And in 2003, we were successful at creating that. The organization went on, once we had successfully done that, they couldn't really hold on to the name ATGOI, which was kind of a silly name, and we knew that when we created it. So they changed the name to the Transgender Education Network of Texas, which has come to be the largest organization working for the education about transgender issues and for the promotion of transgender civil rights in the state of Texas. In the time since then, most large cities in the state of Texas have adopted some form of legal protections for gender identity and sexual orientation. We've had such breakthroughs as marriage equality, which is now the law of the land. I'm constantly amazed when I meet little people and I think about how they will grow up, hopefully, in a world in which they will never have known a time when there wasn't full marriage equality. We've thought that we were on a very positive trajectory for quite some time. We're not quite so sure about that now. There's a number of things that are being promoted that may seriously impact that. 2 years ago now, North Carolina passed a bill called HB 2. This was ramrodded through in a special session, and it took about 8 hours from the time that it was written to it being passed to being signed by the governor of North Carolina and enacted. And they did that in response to the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, passing legislation to protect LGBT and especially T people. And it was really the T people that they were most concerned about. And so they passed an ordinance, and the ordinance has several parts to it. The first is that it strips away the ability of local jurisdictions to pass any kind of ordinance which provides protections that go beyond what the state has passed at a statewide level. So basically it says, sorry, Charlotte, North Carolina, you don't get the right to make laws that make sense to you as a city. The second thing it did was it criminalized people using restrooms that differ from the restroom in which they were assigned at birth, the gender that they were assigned at birth. There's been a huge amount of controversy since that came out, and a huge amount of both good news and bad news. The bad news was that a bill like that passed in the first place. The good news has been the overwhelming response from so many places saying this is not something that we can allow to stand. I couldn't ever imagine the day that someone like Bruce Springsteen would get up and say, no, I can't condone this treatment of trans people, and I'm not going to be playing in North Carolina. He's the boss. Yay, I know, right? That says to me a huge amount about how much the public perception has changed. And I think largely because of people like Laverne Cox being very openly trans. No longer can you just look at that and go, yeah, well, that's John Lithgow. That's not a real trans person. She is a real trans person, and she has a very compelling story. And it humanizes trans people in a way that John Lithgow, bless his heart, never could. So we have bathroom bills being introduced in North Carolina. We have this huge outgrowth of people saying, no, that's not okay. It's been estimated that the economic impact to the state of North Carolina is approximately $600 million. Moving forward, I think a lot of us were shocked the morning after the election, because I don't think many of us expected the sudden change in the political climate that happened at the beginning of November. I think a lot of us were really on this trajectory that we would start seeing things like insurance coverage that would start paying for transgender medical care that would become the law of the land. Just to kind of clarify, until fairly recently, and certainly when I was coming out, there was no such thing as insurance anywhere that actually would pay for medical procedures for trans people. And indeed, trans people tended to be highly marginalized within the medical community. Here in Austin, a good friend of mine, Elizabeth Westbrook, was a trans woman. She was and this is just an example of a story, she was a published poet. She was working on a graduate degree from Texas State University. She was on the board of directors of Lady Fest Austin. She was one of the first trans identified people to appear in the Vagina Monologues. She was an amazing person and an activist and a dear friend. She went to a local hospital one day here in Austin. This would have been in 2002, so not ancient history. She was having severe abdominal pain, and she went to the hospital, and they treated her perfectly reasonably, right up until the doctor realized that she was transgender, at which time he told her to get dressed, told her that there was nothing that could be done for her, that she just had a virus, that she needed to drink lots of OJ and get out of his emergency room. She went to her private physician the next morning and discovered that she had a ruptured appendix. There were a series of 3 surgeries trying to contain the sepsis. They were unsuccessful, and I think she was 34 when she died. So I always try to remember her. This was not ancient history, and we've come a long way since then in terms of working towards things like medical coverage that is trans-sensitive. I wish I knew where this was going after the election. Certainly, there are just some whisperings of things that might happen as a result of the election. We've watched the current president-elect appointing cabinet members who are very decidedly not LGBT friendly and who are concerning in a number of ways, not the least of which is things like climate denial, climate change denial, worries about things like reproductive rights and abortion issues, LGBT rights. We don't know what Donald Trump's ultimate strategies will be, and I can't address that too much other than to say that there's a whole lot of people out there praying for the health and well-being of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, she has got a huge place in my heart, and we're praying that she has a long and healthy life, and some other people in the Supreme Court. We know that there will be at least one appointee to the Supreme Court to replace the seat that was left vacant by Antonin Scalia. That one should simply restore the balance to where it was before his death. In terms of getting another progressive on the bench, we can certainly hope for health and well-being for all of the judges, such that that's such a crucial thing that may shape policy for many, many, many years. On a local front, in terms of our Texas legislature, in the last legislative session, Texas has a biennial legislature. It meets once every other year. And in the last legislative session, there were some pretty horrific bills. One of them was a bathroom bill. That bathroom bill specified that it would be illegal for a transgender person, for any person, to use a restroom that was not the restroom in which they were assigned at birth. It would make it a misdemeanor for that person to use the restroom, and even more egregiously, it would make it a felony. It would make it a felony for the business that allowed that person to use the restroom. Okay, so that really, then, that's a clue as to how they would police that. They would make it hugely onerous for the businesses that would allow it, and then they would police it. Luckily, we were able to defeat that bill. We don't know what the upcoming legislature is going to be. Our top 3 political figures in the state, Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, Greg Abbott, the governor, and Ken Paxton, the attorney general, have all indicated that one of their priorities will be a bathroom bill. We don't know what that's going to look like. It hasn't been filed yet. What we do know is a couple of things that have been filed. Senate Bill 92 has been filed, and what that would do is it would mimic North Carolina, and it would strip away the ability of local jurisdictions to set their own non-discrimination policies. So we've had gender identity as a protected class here in Austin since 2003. That would go away. All of the cities So we're talking about Dallas, Fort Worth, El Paso, San Antonio, Houston, Corpus Christi, Waco, any of those cities that have laws protecting people on either sexual orientation or gender identity and expression would see those laws disappear overnight if Senate Bill 92 passes. Another bill that has been filed is Senate Bill 242. Senate Bill 242 would mandate that schools have to have full disclosure to parents of all aspects of a student's records. What that's really targeting is currently for a number of LGBT youth, the first place they come out to is a counselor at school. And often, specifically to get help with things like the coming out process to their parents, and how do we address this, how do we deal with this, how do we deal with parents potentially being non-supportive. They would no longer have that as a safe option. The minute that they came out, it would be subject to disclosure to the parents. Studies have been done about the prevalence of LGBT people in the homeless population of adolescents. And it is estimated, there was a study that was done, I think in 2005, that surveyed major cities across the United States. I think there were 5 different cities in the study. Austin was one of those. And in that survey, they were looking at what percentage of out-of-home youth identify as LGBT. And what they came up with was 40%. 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. So there's a significant number of people for whom we would be potentially getting rid of one of their first avenues of support in the process of coming out. In terms of a bathroom bill, we don't know yet what that may look like. There is at least some indication. There's been a pretty big push by business in order to try to defeat the bathroom bills, because we see it as so potentially disruptive of business in the state. A study was recently done in which the economic ramifications of a bathroom bill similar to North Carolina's was studied, and it indicated that potentially there could be an $8.5 billion financial impact to the state of Texas should we adopt a bill like that. So right now, our best advocacy is being done by the Texas Association of Business, which is normally a fairly conservative group, but they are very, very much against this bill because of the economic impact. If I go down to the legislature, it's not going to do a whole lot of good, because I'm kind of their worst nightmare. But when business talks, that's a pretty big thing in Texas. So we're kind of pinning a lot of hope on that avenue. There's at least some early indication. Dan Patrick in a interview in Houston a couple of weeks ago indicated that his bill would only affect schools and government buildings. That's a huge rollback from what was introduced in the last legislative session. And not Patrick, but another senator has indicated that in talks that she has had with Patrick, that really the only thing that's his main focus is schools. Well, this is very, very different than what he's been promulgating for quite some time now. And there's at least some suspicion among some people in the activist community that this is really just kind of keeping a low profile, hoping that the furor dies down, resistance dies down, and then they can push it through a little bit easier. So this is not a time to think, oh yeah, nothing to worry about. We still have some very even if the very mildest of those is what's passed, we'd still be looking at schools being adversely impacted. We've got a student right now in the Dripping Springs Independent School District who was having no problems at all using the restroom in which they had identified, and somehow it slipped out to some parents that was happening. They called a huge town meeting, and it's kind of blown up into a huge issue. If anyone is interested, I believe that there's going to be a school board meeting tomorrow night in Dripping Springs, and it would be a great place to show up and to provide some support. So schools are potentially at risk, especially when you take the conjunction of whatever up-and-coming bathroom bill, Senate Bill 242, which would require that parental notification, and Senate Bill 92, which would strip away local ordinances. That's probably our least worst case scenario. There's other things that could happen. One of the things that's been important for transgender people is being able to get their legal documentation changed to more accurately reflect their identity. Up to this point, that has always been done by judges. That we have any judge, county judge, can write a court order just like they would a name change, allowing the gender marker to be changed. There's at least some indication that there might be legislation put forth that would prohibit that. So we could lose that ability to even be able to change documentation to reflect how we present in the world. So there's a lot of things going on. Will they pass? Will they not pass? It is really too early to tell. Certainly I think we're in for a rocky road and a time when activism is an important thing to move forward. So I feel like I've kind of gone on and on and on. I probably didn't get to some of the things that I said I was going to, like terminology and stuff, but sorry. There is time for questions and answers, so we can go ahead and move to that now.
We have about 25 minutes left for question and answer. I've got a question. I'd like to hear about your clinical practice and the population that you serve.
My clinical practice, I work probably about 60% of my clinical practice is made up of trans-identified people. The balance of it is other gender and sexual minorities. Just to kind of a little bit, this could be a whole nother talk. The history of transition in America kind of started in 1954 with Christine Jorgensen being the first American that we're familiar with who went through the transition process. And when she transitioned, I think the only way she was able to convince doctors to do it was by making this case about how desperate she was, how she was a woman trapped in a man's body, and I think only because of the desperation that she evinced did they allow her to go through with it. But that kind of set the model for everyone's transition for the next 50 years. In order to convince someone to allow you to transition, you had to kind of go through this whole thing. I'm so desperate, I will kill myself if I can't do this. And there was a huge amount of policing such that, for instance, if you were transgender and you could not pass as a non-trans person, you would never be allowed to transition. I would never have been allowed to transition. I have this deep voice, I'm tall, I've got broad shoulders. I don't really care about passing. I'm very proud of being a trans person, and I don't mind being very open about it. But prior to just a very few years ago, if you didn't pass as non-transgender, you'd never be allowed to transition. If your affectional orientation, if you were a trans woman and you were attracted to other women, you'd never be allowed to transition. They weren't out to make lesbians. That's crazy. So there was this very, very 1950s model. I had a good friend who was denied letters for hormones because she drove a Jeep, and that wasn't considered a feminine car. Okay? This is not ancient history here. This is like 10 years ago. Okay? And so it was a policing of standards and stuff that were very archaic. And it's only been fairly recently that we started moving out of that. So I work a lot with things like non-binary people, people who just do not fit male or female categories and are perfectly happy not fitting those categories. I work a lot with people in the poly community. I work with people who are queer identified, and I know some people find offensive that term. I think other people find it very liberating as a more of a designation that doesn't have as many rules and stuff with it. So a very varied population I work with.
This is Peter Ty. I'd like to, it's only a few months ago that I became aware of the LGBTQ edition. Can you explain the history of that and what the Q means? And
yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. You know, it started off with gay rights, and then lesbian rights, and then people started saying, well, how about us bisexual people? Where do we fit in there? And then it kind of suddenly started becoming an alphabet soup. The T was the next one to be added for the transgender community. And when that first started happening, I remember when I was coming out, and at the time I was working as a substance abuse counselor, as Carolyn said, we used to work together at a halfway house here in town back before I was the glamorous person I am today. And at that time, I remember going to a conference, and this still happens. People would say, yeah, I would talk to clinicians, and they'd say, yeah, we're trans-friendly. We got trans-friendly stuff. But they really knew nothing at all about working with the trans community. They just wanted to be up to date and market it, so they just added a T on the end of the alphabet soup and proclaimed that they were trans-friendly without any clue what that meant. We've gotten a little bit better, hopefully. Then we started adding things like Q for questioning. You know, well, sure, we want to be inclusive of everybody, so Q for questioning. Now the Q more often stands for queer. We started coming up with LGBTQI, I for intersex, LGBTQI 2S for two-spirit, which is Native American people who traditionally have what's called a two-spirit identification. LGBTQI2S, for allies. It got to be too long a laundry list. I think more and more we just kind of stick to LGBTQ. So, and it'll probably change next week.
I wanted to ask you about this economic impact thing on the bathroom laws or whatever. Is that? I just wondered if you could maybe is that like fines for businesses who? What comprises that impact?
So I haven't read the full study, but I think mostly what they're looking at is loss of businesses. businesses who choose to move their companies elsewhere, sports venues that elect to have things like championship games held elsewhere, entertainers who choose to no longer come and provide venues here in the state. I think they've primarily extrapolated that from the $600 million economic impact in North Carolina to the difference in our business community here in Texas, the fact that we have many very LGBT positive businesses that we might lose. Just looking at things like here in Austin, Apple, AT&T, Facebook, Google, all of these companies that are very pro-LGBT rights, who could conceivably determine to take their business elsewhere.
Peter Ty had a follow-up question.
Oh.
You said that the Q could generally stand for queer, but what does it mean in terms of identity, behavior, identification? What does the Q add to the mix that wasn't there before?
Yeah. Well, so there's a whole nother lecture as you start talking about things like queer identity and queer politics, and in academic circles, there's a very specific process called queer theory, which states that to queer something means to challenge the accepted norms in a conscious and deliberate manner. So, for instance, for many years, people who were feminine lesbians were seen as being people who were simply trying to hide and not be visible as out lesbians. And one of the things that we've started seeing more and more often, especially in queer identified circles, is lesbians who are very feminine, but also put their own spin on it, so that they're still very visible as lesbians, but also really kind of playing with what is this set of social construct that we call femininity, in such a way that it kind of throws it back and says, yeah, I'm feminine, but I'm going to be feminine in my own way. And I'm going to do it in a way that kind of challenges those societal norms. So that would be an example of what it is to queer something. There's also this idea of what's called heteronormativity. This idea that there's a normal way that people go through the world that has historically been very much, in the last 50 years, based on kind of a 1950s model of what it is to be heterosexual. And that's kind of the set of norms that trans people were required to adhere to. For instance, just as an example of heteronormativity, people often say to me, well, Paula, you know, I get, okay, you're transgender, but what about your voice? You don't have a woman's voice. And I say, well, of course I do. I'm a woman. This is my voice. Ergo, it is a woman's voice. You know? So that's that idea of taking an accepted norm and challenging it. That could be a form of queering. Well, now this also happens within the gay and lesbian community. So that just like there's something like heteronormativity, you can have homonormativity, which says, well, you know, when you're a lesbian, you got to go out and get the lesbian haircut. And it's kind of a mullet, and it's short, and it's, you know, and then once you get the lesbian haircut, they give you a complimentary U-Haul and a toaster oven, and you go on your way as a nice homonormative lesbian. So queering is about saying, no, I'm not going to do that. That's, you know, mullet, really? you know? And so the queering is kind of a saying, we want to challenge any of those boxes. We want to live our lives, even if it means not accepting the norms of clothing, of dress, etc., that the world is so much broader, more diverse, and more celebratory a place than nice, simple little boxes, you know? So that, for instance, someone like me, and I'm wearing a skirt and a little bit of makeup today, but that's really not kind of my norm. I'm usually kind of a blue jeans and t-shirt kind of a gal. And if the idea is that in order to be acceptable, I need to look like a 1950s housewife, I resist that. Had I done that in my transition, if I had gone, I am not a guy, I don't feel comfortable being seen as a guy, this doesn't make sense, I'm going to, you know, and then, oh, I need to go look like a 1950s housewife, and I get over there and I spend all this time, money, and effort getting to that box, and then I go, oh, this doesn't feel any closer to who I am either. Okay, then maybe the place I feel most comfortable, which is where I really do feel comfortable, is in a place that just says, I'm going to challenge all of those standards, and I'm going to live my life how I see myself, which is just me. I hope I answered your question. I feel like it's probably been an inadequate response. Okay, good.
Okay, we have a question from Douglas Bauer.
It's been an excellent presentation. I work in a local high-tech company, and as you mentioned a few minutes ago, a lot of these high-tech companies are supportive of diverse communities, and you know, my particular group, I have openly gay people in our group. That being said, you know, if we were to get a new CEO someday, and he suddenly changed the company's values, are there any legal protections for gay and transgender people in corporations today, either Austin, Texas, or nationally?
Nationally, no. In a number of states do have statewide protections, where they have actually said as a state, we're going to provide the same kind of protections that you might have for race, gender, etc. In Austin, we have those protections, and that was kind of the protections that we worked on developing that went into effect in 2003. Those are also the protections that Senate Bill 92 would eliminate. So, yes, all of the cities in Texas that have worked really hard to establish those in local municipalities, those would all go away. So they're working on stripping that away. And even things like, you know, we think that now we've got marriage equality, that's under fire too. I don't think that they can get rid of all of marriage equality, but they're starting to chip away at it in a similar way that they've been working at chipping away at abortion rights. Greg Abbott recently sent an amicus brief to the Texas Supreme Court putting forth the argument of what does it really mean to recognize same-sex marriage? We can recognize it. Does that mean that we have to actually provide marriage benefits? And the argument being that it doesn't. And that all they have to do is create a separate class and say, yeah, we recognize your little marriage. Good luck getting benefits with it. So we're seeing some effort coming up to start chipping away at some of those stuff. And I think that we're in a place where lots of the work that we've done over the last 20 years could start being eroded.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left and time for more questions. So I'll bring the microphone to you if you have one.
I can keep talking.
It's like Bonnie Gardner has a question.
Yes, thank you. I agree. Excellent presentation. We know that there have been trans people for thousands of years. Is there any history of trans people that you think is academically solid and worth reading?
Oh, there's so much out there. And you're right, trans people, this is not a new phenomenon. We look at late Stone Age and early Iron Age burials in Europe, just as an example. So we're looking at archaeological finds of burials dating back maybe 20,000 years, in which the person being buried, when you look at anatomical structures of bone structures, structures in the pelvis that would indicate that the person that was buried had an anatomically male skeleton. And yet they were buried in what was very clearly not just the burial of a female person, but of a very highly respected and highly placed individual within society who was female. Okay, so we're going back 20,000 years. In North America, and there's examples of trans people, gender variant, third gender people around the world, going back thousands of years. In the Americas, maybe 40% of North American indigenous peoples recognized 3 and 4 different genders. When the Spaniards first came to America and the conquistadors, that was actually one of the ways that they justified genocide. Look at the Sodomites. They're obviously uncivilized. We need to civilize them in any way we can, and that means wiping them out, taking all of their land, their gold, and their silver. Well, so be it. And it's okay because they're really kind of subhuman because they're a bunch of sodomites. The sodomites that they were referring to were the trans people, the gender variant people. There's a famous woodcut of the conquistador Balboa, who, quote, discovered the Pacific Ocean, feeding the trans people to the dogs. It's a very easy woodcut. You can find images of it online. So there's been a history of not only trans people, India. And today in India, trans people, third gender people, the Hijra, are starting to make political inroads, kind of in a similar manner through history. The Europeans, even though they have a ancient history of accepting trans people, fairly early on they abandoned that, and then wherever they went, they tried to push their viewpoints about it on other peoples, partly as one of their ways that they engaged in colonialism. So that, for instance, the Hijras in India were fairly well-placed, respected individuals until the British came along, at which point they started being stigmatized. The Hijras are interesting. One of the ways that they would have survived marginalization has been that they would be people that would bestow blessings at weddings. And if you didn't give them money, they put a curse on you. And so they were both, they were feared and kind of respected, but feared. And one of the ways that they started kind of building their own sense of empowerment was they started being employed as debt collectors. And people would pay up their debts because they didn't want to be subjected to the Hijra curses. And so they started finding their own empowerment. Thailand has the greatest number of surgeons in the world per capita working on providing transition services for trans people. because they have a long history of trans people called Katui. And in Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia that was never occupied by a European colonizing things. So, for instance, all of the countries in Southeast Asia have that history. In countries like Vietnam that was colonized by the French, a lot of that was suppressed. Thailand has remained a Buddhist country since the beginning and never had that colonizing presence. And so the acceptance of the trans people in Thailand has remained much less affected. So yeah, lots of history.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left if you'd like to just sum up.
Well, as you probably discerned by now, I could talk about this ad infinitum. So here's what I want to leave it at, was there's still a lot of work to be done. Certainly there's a huge amount of work to be done politically right now in terms of transgender rights. The conservatives would have you believe that there's imminent danger of transgender people in restrooms, and yet of the, I think, 14 states that have statewide trans protections guaranteeing public accommodation for trans people, non-discrimination. Austin, where we've had it since 2003, there are pretty much zero recorded cases of people being threatened, accosted, assaulted by trans people in restrooms. I think that trans people are in far more danger of being assaulted. So I think just look at why would people put that out. I think the reason that stuff gets promulgated is because if you can scare people, then you can encourage them to vote for you. You convince people that there's a threat. You convince them that you have the answer. You put a lot of misinformation out there, and then you can garner power. And that's something that we should all be critical of, to go out and do research, to learn about things, and then make good, informed decisions.
Thank you very much, Paul.
So, thank y'all.
Thank you.